This is Chapter 12, Management of Human Resources. So let's talk a little bit about the evolution of human resources. So the basic functions is really to hire, fire, train, develop, and compensate staff. And human resource management really is more of the recent terminology for it, and it's moved into more of an integrative process of selecting, training, developing, compensating, supervising, and maintaining the workforce that's needed. So human resources management is really the management function of that middle piece, that transformation process of the food service system. So let's talk a little bit about different types of HR management when we talk about the type of organization. So if you remember from Chapter 9, we talked about traditional and innovative type of organizations. We're going to talk about that in very similar nature when it comes to human resources. So let's look at the traditional focused human resources. So this could be in a traditional type of organization, potentially, where your corporate culture is really focused on productivity, profit, your bottom line essentially, looking at individual performance, autocratic leadership, treating problems as they arise, and there's typically a limited amount of employee programs available. Jobs in these instances are typically characterized under specific job descriptions. Limited job skill is needed for these positions. They have a narrow span of control in their role. There's standardized procedures put into place. It's productivity and efficiency is really what's focused on. How much can you produce? And there's much more of a top-down communication from your CEO down as far as information and decisions that are made. And performance measures are really an individual effort and individual goals. And usually your review is done just by your direct supervisor themselves. So traditional focused can be found typically in more traditional type of organizations. Now, total quality focused human resources, you'll find maybe more in an innovative organization potentially. Their corporate culture is really focused on quality of the product or the outcome, customer satisfaction, and they really do look at team performance, coaching, leadership, and preventing problems before they arise instead of treating them as they come up. And typically in these organizations, there are lots of employee-focused programs, lots of employee assistance or wellness opportunities. Like we had talked about before, maybe they have a gym on site where you're encouraged to go and on your lunch hour and work out. Jobs under these types of organizations and human resource are characterized by autonomous, empowered teams, broad range where you're a lot of problem solving skills, very innovative, customization and wide span of control of things that you have control over. A lot of problem solving, a lot of multi-directional up and down communication with managers and your peers. And then performance measures are really a team effort, and they look at quality and service, not necessarily your outcomes. And in these instances, your review is done by your supervisor, but there's input also provided from your customers as well as your peers. So when we talk about human resource planning, and it's crucial when you have any type of operation to have a strategic plan in place so you know your goals and objectives, and human resources definitely needs to be involved in that strategic plan to know what is the expectation, where are we trying to go, and what kind of resources people-wise do we need to get to that end plan or that end goal. Human resources are often or should be involved in forecasting supply and demand of workforce. So knowing, how many individuals are out there that maybe have a certain skill set for what they're looking for, as well as the demand that's out there. Supply analysis, knowing how much or how many individuals are needed, and then balancing that, which is always very tricky. I mean, food service is always dealing with that balancing of supply and demand, having enough individuals to do the jobs that are needed. Job analysis we'll talk about in the following slide, but that is part of human resource planning. Job design, which essentially is to improve your job satisfaction, which leads to job enlargement and job enrichment. So as you can probably imagine from the term enlargement, this is giving you more responsibilities within your job, giving you more things to do, creating a larger span of control. Where job enrichment may be providing opportunities for advancement or learning, so attending conferences or attending different trainings to improve your knowledge on a certain topic. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about job analysis. First is your job description, essentially what it is that you are required to do, what is the title of the job, who does it report to, and we have another slide on exactly what that all entails in the next slide. Job specification, also known as your KSAs or your knowledge, skills, and assessments that are needed for that specific job. So what kind of knowledge base do you need a degree, or you need a bachelor's degree in some area? What kind of skill sets do you need to come with? Maybe you need to be able to type a number of words a minute, depending on your job. And then performance standards. So these are the standards that you will be evaluated against on typically a yearly basis. Usually in new hires, you are evaluated once every 6 months for a probationary period. But so these standards are in place and relate to the job that you are performing. So, if you're getting out so many meals per day, or providing so many certain items, it's obviously going to depend on the job. So let's talk a little bit about job description. The job description itself obviously can have the job title, job identification, so who does it report to, what department does that job fall into, and then who does it report to. Qualifications, as we kind of mentioned before, what kind of background do you need, what kind of knowledge, skills do you need, and then job duties, so what is required of the job, what are you going to be actually doing in that role. So in HR, it is important to know some laws impacting your position and your employees. Now you'll notice on the screen there are a lot of them here. I wouldn't be too concerned about knowing all of them. I really want you to focus on 3 different ones. And the first one is the Title VII Act of the Civil Rights Act. This really established the EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and we'll talk more about that, what it entails, in the next slide. The second one I want you to be aware of is the Americans with Disabilities Act. This prohibits any discrimination against people with physical or mental disabilities or the chronically ill. So you cannot discriminate against a person who would apply for a position if they have a physical or mental disability. And then last, I want you to be aware of the Family and Medical Leave Act, or FMLA. This gives employees up to 12 weeks of unpaid job-protected leave per year for themselves for personal illness or birth or adoption of a child, or to care for a spouse, a parent, child, or a member of armed forces with a serious health condition. So you'll find that this could come up with employees who may have a baby and they leave to take care of that child for 12 weeks. And this essentially protects their job so they can come back to the same position that they left prior to the birth of their child, or prior to the illness of their spouse or child or parent. So during that time, as a manager, you have to cover that position, but it's not a position you can hire and then fill, because you still have somebody in that position. They are just on an unpaid 12-week leave. So it does create, some creative staffing when it comes to being a manager, to be able to cover that individual's shifts or work while they are gone, but it does protect the employee by not having to give up their position to leave to take care of their family. So let's talk a little bit about the EEOC legislation. Prohibits discrimination based on age, gender, color, and etc. It also prohibits any kind of sexual harassment, which is considered a form of gender discrimination. And most organizations have a no tolerance or zero tolerance for sexual harassment in the workplace, and it's covered under this legislation. It also covers immigration, and here in Arizona, we have what's called E-Verify, where you are verifying your status for work and availability of work. And then it does cover disabilities, which we had mentioned before, and the Americans with Disabilities, you cannot discriminate against any employee or potential employee based on disability. So in the HR process, employment process, it is there's a couple steps to it where you're recruiting, and this can be done in a lot of different ways, where it's posting ads online or through LinkedIn or a variety of different employment opportunities or resources out there. There is a selection process, which we'll talk more about in just a minute, and then orientation. And I find orientation happens to be one of the ones that sadly gets glossed over in many organizations, where they don't necessarily orient their new staff to the new organization completely. A lot of organizations have a one-day orientation that kind of gives you an overview of the organization itself, but not necessarily to the position that you've been selected for. So orientation is definitely going to vary depending on the organization that you are working for. But employees find if they don't have a proper orientation, they often feel lost, have a lot more questions as they progress as a new employee. So we talk about the selection process. There's obviously application and screening, looking at applications and screening those that meet the qualifications, or at least basic qualifications, and those that don't. There might be some testing involved for those potential applicants, and we can talk in the next couple slides about what that may look like. Typically in most organizations, there is a background or at least a reference check of where that individual used to work. A lot of times reference checks could be just verification of employment. Then there's a stage of interviews, which we'll talk more detailed types of interviews that are out there now or common. Some organizations or positions might have a medical exam associated with it. When I was an intern, a new dietetic intern, I actually had to have a chest x-ray to verify I didn't have TB or pneumonia. So that could be something for a position. And then last but not least, the hiring decision on who it is that you want to hire for that position. So as mentioned, there could be some tests that potential applicants or potential employees could be put through prior to the selection process. And you see on the screen, there's a whole bunch of different ones, and it's really going to depend on the position that you're applying for. It's common to maybe do job knowledge tests, or maybe a cognitive aptitude test. Personality tests are becoming more common as far as, assessing somebody's personality and how well would they fit with the values and the mission of the company themselves. Polygraph, I could think of maybe if you're going into the FBI or CIA, something of a higher level security, maybe you would be required to have a polygraph test. Let's talk about some different types of interviews that are common and type of interview questions. So we have structured versus unstructured interviews. So structured, you can think of questions that are potentially close-ended but maybe situational, and are asked in the same manner and in the same order to every single applicant that comes through. These are usually for lower level positions, not typically management or CEO level positions, but oftentimes these are behavioral, like what would you do if you saw somebody stealing, or if you were in this situation, how would you react? So those are more of a structured interview, and these can be one-on-one, with one individual interview, or it can be in a panel, which panels seem to be more common nowadays, where you have multiple people asking you questions in a kind of a round robin format. The second one, unstructured, is like pretty much the opposite. It's questions that are very open-ended and may not necessarily be asked of every individual. Examples of tell me about yourself. This is a very open-ended question that can go in a variety of different ways. The intent here is to determine the applicant's communication skills, how well of a fit they would be for the organization, how much have they done their homework to know about the organization that they're applying for or applying to, and that they can tailor their answer to really what a applicant or a employer would want to hear or to know about them, and for the purposes of the job that they're applying for. So once you do get through that whole process and you have a workforce, how do you keep that? How do you keep a stable and efficient workforce? Well, it first starts with training and development and providing proper training so your staff knows what's expected of them, and being able to help them grow and move up in the organization itself. Having a routine performance appraisal, and we'll talk more about that, but evaluating their work and their work effort and where they've done a great job and where there's opportunity for improvement. And having promotions, so ability to be promoted, which is in personnel actions. People don't typically like to stay in places where there's no room for growth or opportunity for advancement. So being able to keep that workforce, those same individuals, if you can promote within, it does typically encourage people to stay within the organization. In addition to that, having a clear employee discipline procedure if you do need to go down that road and have employees who maybe are not coming to work on time, or there are issues that arise, having a clear discipline procedure in place. And then fair compensation. So people are getting the pay that is appropriate and enough for them to live on, and it's a fair compensation. And they're getting raises on a routine basis. So as far as a performance appraisal system, there are some characteristics to think about for it to be effective. One being that you're appraising and evaluating your staff on job-related criteria and not their personal, personality traits, that they are effective in what they're doing and they're producing what they should. And there's appropriate performance expectations. There's some standardization, so you are doing or providing the same evaluation procedure to each individual employee within that department, that it doesn't vary from employee to employee, that appraisers are trained to know what they're doing. To allow for that standardization, you need to have some training. And it's difficult if you don't know what you're doing in an appraisal. There's potential for causing issues or saying something that's inappropriate, or potentially not using job-related criteria. So if I'm not trained and I like Susie, I may evaluate Susie more kindly than Frank, who I don't necessarily like. Hopefully that makes sense. So having training definitely helps. Having continuous open communication, letting your staff know throughout the year how well they're doing. Employees often find or get upset if they have a performance appraisal that they're very surprised. They weren't aware that they weren't doing something correctly, and it just all of a sudden came up in their performance appraisal. This should be something that they were aware of throughout the year and trying to work on it, not just a surprise during their one-on-one with their supervisor. And then due process, some formal grievance procedure if there is something that the employee doesn't agree with, or if there's they're going to be dismissed, there's a formal way for the employee to file a grievance against that and have a process involved so they feel like they've been heard fairly, essentially hear their side of the story. There's a couple different ways that you can do performance appraisals, and you may have had one or a couple of these in your own positions, or if you've been a manager, you may relate to one or two of these. There's a checklist method where there's a list of performance skills or objectives, and you as a manager check off yes, did they meet it, or no, did they not meet it. A rating scale, so this is more of a scale from 1 to 5 or 1 to 4, 1 being they did not meet expectations and 4 is exceeding expectations. So the supervisor would rate each specific objective on that scale. Critical incident, this is more along the lines of maybe an event. How well did that event go? How well was it handled? Was it handled great? Was it handled poorly? And your basic appraisal, your evaluation is based on 1 or 2 events that maybe have happened over the year. Management by objectives, this is typical for higher level managers. So maybe they have an objective to raise their revenue by 5%. And so did they meet that objective? And this is typically objectives set for the department. So the manager is working with their staff to meet those objectives, and then they're evaluated on how well did they meet that. And then last but not least, which is actually getting a little bit more and more common, is 360-degree feedback, where you, the employee, gets feedback from your supervisor, as well as your peers, as well as your customers. And this is common because, if you have a manager who's not, maybe they're managing from a distance, they're not with you every single day, FaceTime wise, it's helpful to get feedback from your peers who may see you every day and know your work ethic and know your contributions maybe more or at a deeper level than your manager would. So it gives a better evaluation. It's a more comprehensive evaluation because you're getting feedback from everyone that you are have interactions with, rather than just your supervisor's perception of how well you're doing. Last but not least, there are some productivity measures in food service I just want you to be aware of. This is nothing that you would be tested on potentially in a future exam. It's just something that as a manager, these could be measurements that are utilized in your environment. So just to be aware of. So meals per labor hour is a very common one, where you have total meals served per day over your labor hours. This helps you assess if you are over or understaffed and how maybe efficient or inefficient your staff is. And payroll costs per day, this obviously helps with determining where you're at as far as compensation is concerned. So all of these listed in figure 1218 are potential measures that a food service operation could use to help with estimating performance, as well as how much staff is needed for any given day or any given meal. And then staffing versus scheduling. I mentioned this previously. So staffing is essentially how many people you have to run the organization or run the kitchen, and scheduling is when do those individuals come in. So I may need 7 cooks overall, but I have those 7 cooks coming in at certain hours. They don't all come in at 7 a.m. They may come in, 2 may come in at 6 or 7 a.m. for breakfast, and then others rotate in at 11 for lunch service, and then others rotate in at 4 for dinner service, while others rotate out. So scheduling is something that's crucial to know as a manager and for HR. It obviously is going to impact your labor costs and your bottom line budget, but you need to be aware of how much staff you actually need to function, and then when those staff should come in.